Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. Hi, I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance to working Rhode Island families. This evening's edition will host Legislative Issues with Jim Parisi, where we bring the legislature into your living room. We hope you enjoy this edition of Legislative Issues and Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision, where we bring the General Assembly right into your living room. My name is James Parisi. I'm a field representative with the Rhode Island Federation of Teachers and Health Professionals, and I'm your host this evening. Today we're going to initiate a conversation about an esoteric but very important area of tax policy labeled carried interest. And with us is the Rhode Island expert on carried interest, Representative Aaron Regunberg. Representative, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much for having me. Don't know about expert, but we'll see what we can do.
I have great faith in your ability to make a complicated thing not so complicated for our viewers. But before we talk about the meat of carried interest and a few other things we may talk about, I always like giving my guests to give a little bit of background to our viewers, how you got involved in politics, how you ended up in the General Assembly, because you've only been there a couple of terms now. So why don't you let our viewers know what got your start in politics?
Sure. Well, I got involved in politics really coming out of community organizing. I helped found a youth-led student organizing program called the Providence Student Union that helped bring high school students together to really fight for the issues that they wanted to see changed in their schools, and then really organize the campaigns that could actually win those changes. And so through that work, I saw how important it is that the folks who are most impacted by decisions actually have a seat at the table, how much better the results are when that happens, and also how rare it is that our systems right now are set up for that. And so helping students advocate at the General Assembly and in other ways, in a political ways, it definitely made me think we need more folks up there who are really committed to helping bring the voices of young people, of working families, of people of color, of women, into those halls of power, because that's the only way we're going to see change. So in 2014, when a seat opened up, I decided to go for it, and since then have been working in the General Assembly to try to help move a progressive policy agenda forward.
So the seat you ran for is Representative District 4. It was an open seat at the time you ran for it?
It was. This was then Speaker Gordon Fox's seat. So March 22nd of 2014, his office was raided by the FBI, and it was looking to be an open seat. And I reached out to some people. I know actually one of our PSU students who lives in the neighborhood. He was the first person I called because I think we need more young people up there. And I was like, have you ever thought about running for office? Mm-hmm. He decided, he was going off to college. It wasn't quite ready at the time. And ultimately, talking to folks, thought it made sense for me to give it a go.
Yeah. And this was your first run for office. You didn't serve on a board or commission or run for council before you took a stab at the General Assembly, right?
That's right, though I was involved in helping some other candidates over a few election cycles, so I had a sense of sort of what it takes to run a good people-powered, grassroots, bottom-up campaign.
So let's dive right in. You have sponsored some legislation with the label carried interest. Why don't you explain to our viewers what you're trying to accomplish by putting in this legislation on carried interest?
So I've been working with Senator Adam Satchel, as well as a coalition of some community and labor groups to push for what we call an end to the carried interest loophole, which from my perspective is one of the most blatantly unfair aspects of our current tax code. And before sort of getting too much into what is the carried interest loophole, I just want to maybe take a step back and explain where we're coming from when we talk about this issue. Mm-hmm. For me, I'm really tired. I'm tired of being up at the State House and hearing over and over again, we don't have the money for that. It'd be great if we could have school buildings that weren't dangerous and unsafe and falling on the heads of children, but we don't have the money for that. It'd be great if we could invest in community health centers, but we don't have the money. It'd be great if our elderly and disabled neighbors could continue to ride RIPTA at a reduced fare, but we don't have the money. We hear that all the time, and from my perspective, from this coalition's perspective, it's not true. We've got the money. The problem is that we keep getting suckered into not collecting it, and I think there's no better example of that than the carried interest loophole. So the idea behind this issue is that in our country right now, carried interest, so income derived from investments, et cetera, is taxed at a much lower rate, half of the top rate for regular income. And there's a certain logic to that. The idea is if you're investing your own money in something, there's a risk there, and we should recognize that, and we could have a debate over the logic of that. The reality is that right now, most of the people who take advantage of the carried interest loophole are not actually investing their own money. We're talking about hedge fund managers, often millionaires and billionaires, who in the context of these hedge funds are investing other people's money. For that work, they're earning these gargantuan fees, which is their income, and then they're taking that income and they're saying this counts as carried interest, and they're getting a much lower tax rate on that. So effectively, these hedge fund millionaires and billionaires are often paying a lower rate than your AFT members, teachers who are working hard, nurses who are struggling to get by, firefighters, folks who are really contributing to our communities, who are trying just to have the basics of living a middle-class life. And they're contributing more to the public good than these folks who can certainly afford to do much more.
So when you make money on an investment, that's a capital gain, and you get taxed at a lower rate than if you just went out and got a job and earned an income. Income tax is different than capital gains tax, but these hedge fund managers claim that their income is a capital gain and it's taxed at a lower rate. How does that happen?
Well, it happens because they, even though they're not investing their own money, they're managing a hedge fund where they're investing other people's money. They're claiming that fee that they receive for that counts under this system. It's not fair, and it's a fascinating issue where it's not even partisan. Folks from across the spectrum have agreed that this doesn't make any sense. Folks in the financial services sector, for the most part, will admit, yeah, this doesn't seem fair. I haven't even really heard anyone make a sort of positive, substantive case for why this should exist. The reason that it still exists is because instead of sort of trying to win on the merits and making that substantive case, every time there's an attempt to change it or reform it, the hedge funds can afford to swamp our halls of government with lobbyists and campaign contributions, and so they swat down those efforts.
I recall during the presidential campaign that both candidate Clinton and then candidate Donald Trump supported getting rid of this loophole on the federal level.
Absolutely. It was consensus across the board. Donald Trump, he was in his populist phase then, and he was saying this doesn't make any sense, pointing at the folks who were taking advantage of the system. Now, we know that was a con, and Donald Trump ended up appointing a whole bunch of those folks he was pointing at to his cabinet. His administration has more Wall Street hacks and billionaires than we've seen in DC for a long time. So I don't have a lot of faith that we're going to see action on this issue coming out of Washington, D.C. And so that really leaves us with action at the state level.
So is the carried interest loophole a federal loophole, or is it a state tax loophole? Help our viewers understand where the engagement is, because your bill deals with the Rhode Island tax code, not the federal tax code.
Right. So the loophole right now is at the federal system, and what we've done with our state legislation is say that we are going to put this additional surcharge on carried interest repatriate that into our Rhode Island state, and try to sort of, in that way that we can, using state action, try to close this loophole at the federal level. Now, the legislation says that the moment that Washington, D.C. gets its act together and follows through on these commitments that Democrats and Republicans alike have all agreed should make sense to close it, then our state tax will, go away because we've solved it at the national level. But until we've done that, and as I said, I don't have a lot of faith in our capacity in D.C. to do this in the near future, we think it makes sense for states to step up, to take action, and by the way, to work together on this. So we've been talking with legislative and organizational colleagues in states across the Northeast. There's similar legislation to this that's being introduced in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey, as well as some other states outside of the Northeast. And the idea is all these different bills have trigger language. So we're saying none of us are going to sort of go out ahead and do this on our own. If this legislation passes in Rhode Island, it won't actually go into effect until some of those neighboring states have also passed the same thing. So the idea is we can solve this as a region. If DC is not going to step up, then the states have to.
And that also gets rid of the argument that people are going to move across borders to avoid paying their fair share if one state adopts it and the other state doesn't.
That's right. And again, just to keep in mind, this isn't just an abstract fairness issue. We're talking about revenue that our state needs to do all the important things that we do, to invest in our schools, to try to have a plan so that our so we're not sending kids to school in buildings that are dangerous and unsafe and falling apart.
So I saw in recent reports that some of the estimates on how much money we're getting from taxes next year are actually down, that our economy's not growing as fast as people had hoped and expected, and we've got a budget gap of over $40 million that I know our legislature is going to have to close this year. How much money are we talking about with the carried interest loophole?
So it actually comes out to about what that budget gap is that we would have in a year. And so when we're talking about choices and priorities, with those revenues that are down, we're going to be looking at some potentially very difficult choices in the General Assembly over the next several weeks. And we shouldn't look at those choices in a vacuum. Like I said at the beginning, the issue isn't necessarily that we don't have the money, it's where we're choosing to put that money. And so if we're going to say, because revenues are down, we need to cut health care for folks who need it the most, and at the same time we're not going to close a loophole for millionaires and billionaires that are getting taxed at a lower rate than hardworking middle-class families, to me that doesn't seem to make any sense or be good policy.
Sure. So I know we're taping this in May, and we haven't had a bill hearing yet, but what, if anything, are you hearing from your colleagues or folks in the halls of the State House about your issue of carried interest?
So the bill's been referred to the Finance Committee, and I think we'll have a committee hearing in the next couple weeks. When I talk to my legislative colleagues about this issue, it seems to make sense to them. Again, it's sort of logical on its face. As I said, it's not a partisan or an ideological issue. You got Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump both saying we need to do this. And I think the fact that we're taking a regional approach, that we're working with other states, should allay a lot of the concerns. Having said that, whenever you've got a new idea in that building, it takes a little time for people to wrap their heads around it, for it to sort of gain acceptance. So we're gonna push it as much as we can this year, and whether we get it over the finish line or not this year, we're building a foundation to really have that robust debate, and hopefully we can get it passed in the not too distant future.
Terrific. So I know you're involved in a lot of different legislative issues, and I know you're active in politics generally, but I know one area of legislation that's near and dear to your heart is related to leave. Why don't we take a few minutes and you can tell our viewers what you're working on as far as getting some kind of state legislation passed related to sick leave.
So glad you asked. Always happy to talk about our earned sick time legislation. It's a real passion for me this session. I've been working with a coalition of labor groups, community groups, domestic violence groups, women's groups, children, child advocates around legislation that would create a right to earned sick time for every Rhode Islander. Right now, over 40% of private sector workers in our state can't earn a single day of paid sick time.
Wow.
And so what that means, and I hear these stories every day from constituents, from folks across our state. Every day in Rhode Island, people are waking up and making a choice between, do I go to work feeling incredibly sick, but I need to in order to pay the rent? My kid is sick. I should stay home with him, get them to the doctor, but I'm worried about, putting food on his table, and so I need to send him to school sick, so that I can get to work. It's a public health issue. We've had folks up at the State House testifying to the realities of working in the food industry. Servers coming to work while feeling incredibly ill, not being allowed to go home. I talked to a young woman recently who said she was so sick once, it was apparent she was sick, her manager wouldn't let her go home until he walked in on her in the bathroom throwing up. And he said, okay, you can go home. And when she got home, there was a call reminding her that she needed to come in the next day. So it's a public health issue. I feel very, very strongly that this is a family issue, both for parents to be able to provide the care that their kids need, and for folks who are caregivers. We have a whole lot of caregivers in our state, and they might be looking after an elderly parent, an elderly aunt or uncle. They might need to take some time off to help their family member get to the doctor or something along those lines.
So it's not only one's individual illness, but it's also family illness as well.
Exactly. And that's why organizations like the AARP have this as a top priority, because they know it impacts folks of every generation.
So let our viewers know a couple of the details. How much sick leave? How is it administered? What employers are we talking about in Rhode Island?
So the legislation we introduced, it's pretty similar to what has passed now in a whole bunch of our neighbors. Massachusetts has passed earned sick time, Connecticut, Vermont, New York State, a bunch of other states. And the idea, the basic formula is that all workers could earn 1 hour of sick time for every 30 hours they work, up to a maximum of 56 hours or 7 days over the course of a year. So it is earned sick time. We've had employers who've been worried about, if we give this, there will be abuse, people will take advantage of it.
It's not like you get a job and 3 weeks later you're taking 6 or 7 days of paid sick time.
Exactly. If you're working full-time, it takes you 6 weeks to earn a single day. There's extra protections for employers. Folks can't utilize the system until they've been at a job for 90 days. So there's a bunch of protections for the employers. We're trying to strike that right balance, knowing that businesses and employers have needs. We don't want to burden them too much, but also knowing that our working families are struggling, that no one should have to choose between their health or their family's health and making rent.
Are business owners uniformly against it, or are there some small businesses or large businesses that can deal with this issue?
We've actually had a lot of support from the business community. In fact, at our hearing in the House Labor Committee, there were practically the same number of business owners who were there in favor as opposed, who were there saying, we do this, we think it's important, and guess what? We get great results from it. Our worker productivity is up because we don't have workers who are in sick or who are worried about their sick kid, because it's hard to put in the time and focus when you're dealing with that. Who say things like, one of our biggest costs is keeping workers, and things like this help with retention. So it's definitely not uniform. There are certain industry lobbying groups who are tied to national organizations who have a clear national sort of perspective on this, and so. But in general, I think this is a win-win-win. We've done polling on it that's shown that well over 85% of Rhode Islanders strongly support this. Again, it's nonpartisan. We have majority of Republicans who say this makes sense. It's not an ideological issue. No one should have to choose between their health or their kids' health and their job.
It's a very pragmatic way for the General Assembly to improve people's lives in a very tangible and immediate way.
Right, it's a security, because a lot of people aren't even going to use all the days that they have, but knowing that they're there when they need it, it's a form of social security for folks. And a lot of people right now in Rhode Island don't have that most basic sense of security. We want to provide that to them.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but Representative Aaron Regunberg, thank you very much for joining us and informing our viewers today.
Thanks so much for having me. That went quick.
It did. And thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision.
Good evening. Welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm your host, Jim Riley. I'm the Labor Liaison of the Rhode Island Institute for Labor Studies and Research. And my guests this evening are Justin Kelley, Business Manager of International Union of Allied Trades, Painters and Allied Trades, and a Local 195, and Laura Brion, Executive Director of the Childhood Lead Action Project. And these two individuals have a correlation regarding the issue tonight, which is bad lead. Justin, the motto of the Rhode Island Building Trades is done once, done right. We have a bad actor working in the community. Let me just give you some highlights of his career, of the career of Brady and Sullivan Properties. Brady Sullivan downplayed health risk of lead dust to tenants. State feds discuss criminal investigations linked to asbestos at Bradley Sullivan's site. EPA says New Hampshire developer Brady Sullivan broke federal lead paint laws. Complaints about toxins, shoddy construction, Trail New England developer. Justin, we got a bad guy here. Why is he doing business in Rhode Island?
Oh, it's a great question, Jim. I think as a lot of people know, there's a lot of mill stock that still exists in the state of Rhode Island. And repurposing and redeveloping these old industrial structures is something that is great, but needs to be done right, especially considering that there's a variety of environmental toxins that exist in these structures. Asbestos, heavy metals, things like cadmium and arsenic. But one of the biggest ones is lead. And we've seen problems in the past with this developer, Brady Sullivan. They're a Manchester, New Hampshire-based developer, general contractor, and owner-operator of luxury condominiums. Brady Sullivan, in addition to the problems they've had in the past, continue to hire what we would consider irresponsible contractors. And in early December, I caught video footage of dust being pushed out onto Eagle Street at the U.S. Rubber Mill complex, which more than likely contained lead. And in an area that already has a huge saturation of lead poisoning, especially in children. So we're looking to see that why a company like Brady Sullivan is the recipient of millions in historic tax credits from the state of Rhode Island and the federal government, when these folks clearly have an issue with legal trouble before, both with the federal and state governments in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and now Rhode Island. There's open Department of Health and Department of Environmental Management investigations into the U.S. Rubber Mill site. And the Rhode Island Painters Union, in conjunction with several community groups, are very, very concerned with lead as an overall hazard to workers and to our community at large and to our children. My members, a lot of them live in Providence. Mm-hmm. I live in Providence, about a 5-minute drive away from this project.
You said the U.S. rubber plant, what is it again?
U.S. Rubber Mill.
I believe that there's some historical perspective there, isn't there? I believe Dr. Scott Malloy wrote a book about that.
Yeah, I believe the book was Irish Titan, Irish Toilers.
And this is the same building where that took place all those years ago.
The same building where the Knights of Labor and Irish industrialist Joseph Bannigan squared off. And so you see a full circle, for better or for worse.
Laura, Brion, thank you first of all for the great work that you and your organization does. And tell us more about your organization and what you're doing. And you can see the correlation between these two organizations. They're spitting lead dust out into a community, and you're trying to deal with children who are having lead problems. And this is generally in more needier communities, from what I understand.
Exactly.
So tell us about yourself and your organization.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Sure.
So the mission of the Childhood Lead Action Project is to eliminate childhood lead poisoning in Rhode Island through a combination of parent support, education, and advocacy. And we've been working on this issue since even before we were actually officially founded in 1992. And our goal has been to bring together people who have been directly affected by this issue and people who are concerned about it and can help to come up with ways that we can prevent more children from being lead poisoned in Rhode Island. Our goal is to get rid of lead poisoning entirely. We are very proud of the success that we've been able to achieve over the years. There's been a dramatic reduction in the incidence of lead poisoning in Rhode Island. However, we still have a very long way to go, and the last thing that we need is to see this problem exacerbated by a company that can clearly afford to do everything right to protect the workers and the community, and which clearly has already learned its lesson after harming people in other states throughout New England. There are over, nearly 1,000 children were lead poisoned for the very first time in 2015, the most recent year that the Department of Health has reported out those statistics for. And nearly around a third of those were right here in Providence. Over the years, Providence and our other core cities have suffered the most from this issue. Poor families and families of color have suffered the most. So you see an area that's a sad but prime example of environmental injustice, social injustice, where this is just adding insult to injury.
It seems like a lot of folks will think that lead's not really much of an issue anymore. Oh, lead paint was a problem years ago when kids used to eat the chips here and there off their walls or whatnot. But apparently it is a big problem. I know when I'm working on a program right now, Fix Our Schools Now. You have a bunch of folks in different organizations, and there was a report that came out about 7 years ago regarding the sort of environmental state of our schools. And it was a very bad report that the schools are a mess. They've got contaminated water, they've got mold, and they've got lots of lead paint. And as a matter of fact, the governor saw this and actually ordered her own study, which is coming out in June. And it'll be interesting to see if the problem still exists. And another interesting part about it is that it tends to be a socioeconomic issue. You don't have the lead paint problems. The average school in the state of Rhode Island is about 60 years old. But most of those schools are, of the really older schools, are in the older communities that tend to have a socioeconomic situation where some of the children are going to schools and that don't have maybe the kind of resources to get the place fixed or whatnot. So this is not an issue that's done or over by any means whatsoever.
Yeah.
Right, the conditions that lead to lead poisoning are both the presence of lead in paint in homes and structures throughout Rhode Island, the presence of lead in plumbing, and the presence of lead contamination in our soil. But when you add on the challenges of not being able to afford to fix those up and do regular maintenance, you have a recipe for an ongoing problem.
What can we do? What can the people in the community do to help your organization?
We'd love to see people get involved in this campaign. They can contact the organization and let us know about how this issue has affected them and what kinds of solutions they need to see to protect their children and their community.
How do they contact your organization?
They can go online and look us up on the web. We are at leadsafekids.org. That's LEADSAFEKIDS.org. Or they can call the office at 785-1310.
Thank you, both of my guests, Justin and Laura, and thank you for the fabulous work that you both do. And thank you again for watching Labor Vision.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen on this channel 3 times each week: Tuesday at 7 p.m., Thursday at 8 p.m., and Saturday at 5 p.m.